Hello. In this series, I'm going to be reading from Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks, his thinking, his philosophy, written in the 1920s, informs much of my techno workout programming, philosophy, and approach. The intent is to create alternative sources of collective will through the use of techno music, weightlifting, and revolutionary theory. I decided to do this series when I realized that there wasn't an audio recording of Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. I like to learn by listening. I crochet, I play games on my phone, I work, I clean, I bike while I listen and I learn. So, because there isn't one, I created one. This is from selections from Prison Notebooks, starting with the intellectuals. The formation of the intellectuals. Are intellectuals an autonomous and independent social group, or does every social group have its own particular specialized category of intellectuals? The problem is a complex one, because of the variety of forms assumed to date by the real historical process of the formation of the different categories of intellectuals. The most important of these forms are two. Every social group came into existence on the original terrain of an essential function in the world of economic production, creates together with itself organically one or more strata of intellectuals, which give it an awareness of its own function, not only in the economic, but also in the social and political fields. The capitalist entrepreneur creates alongside himself the industrial technician, the specialist in political economy, the organizers of a new culture, and a new legal system. It should be noted that the entrepreneur himself represents a higher level of social elaboration, already characterized by a certain directive and technical or intellectual capacity. He must have a certain technical capacity not only in the limited sphere of his activity and initiative, but in other spheres as well, at least in those which are closest to economic production. He must be an organizer of masses of men. He must be an organizer of the confidence of investors in his business, of the customer's first product, etc. If not all entrepreneurs, at least an elite amongst them must have the capacity to be an organizer of society in general, including all its complex organism of services, right up to the state organism, because of the need to create the conditions most favorable to the expansion of their own class. Or, at the least, they must possess the capacity to choose the deputies, specialized employees, to whom to entrust this activity of organizing the general system of relationships external to the business itself. It can be observed that the organic intellectuals which every new class creates along its side itself and elaborates in the course of its development are for the most part specializations of partial aspects of the primitive activity of the new social type which the new class is brought to organize. Even warlords were possessors of a particular technical capacity, military capacity. It is precisely from the moment in which the aristocracy loses its monopoly of technical military capacity that the crisis of feudalism begins. But the formation of intellectuals in the feudal world and in the preceding classical world is a question to be examined separately. This formation and elaboration follows ways and means which must be studied concretely. Thus, it is to be noted that the mass of the peasantry, although it performs an essential function in the world of production, does not elaborate its own organic intellectuals, nor does it assimilate any stratum of traditional intellectuals, although it is from the peasantry that the other social groups draw many of the intellectuals, and a high proportion of traditional intellectuals are of peasant origin. However, every essential social group which has marched into history under the preceding economic structure, and as an expression of a development of this structure, has found, at least in all of history up to the present, categories of intellectuals already in existence, and which seemed indeed to represent a historical continuity uninterrupted even by complicated and radical changes in political social forms. The most typical of these categories of intellectuals is that of the elasticists. For a long time, for a whole phase of history, which is partly characterized by this very monopoly, held monopoly of a number of important services. Religious ideology, that is the philosophy and science of the age, together with schools, education, morality, justice, charity, good works, etc. The category of ecclesiastics can be considered the category of intellectuals organically bound to the landed aristocracy. It had equal status juridically with the aristocracy, with which it shared the exercise of free ownership of land and the use of state privileges connected with property. But the monopoly held by the ecclesiastics in the superstructural field was not exercised without a struggle or without limitations, and hence there took place the birth in various forms, to be gone into and studied concretely, of other categories, favored and enabled to expand by the growing strength of the central power of the monarch, right up to us. Thus we find the formation of the noblesse de robe with its own privileges, a stratum of administrators, scholars, and scientists, theorists, non-ecclesiastics, philosophers, etc. Since these various categories of traditional intellectuals experience through an esprit their uninterrupted historical continuity and their special qualifications, they thus put themselves forward as autonomous and independent of the dominant social group. This self-assessment is not without consequences in the consequences of a wide range. The whole of idealist philosophy can easily be connected with this position assumed by the social complex of intellectuals and can be defined as the expression of social utopia by which the intellectuals think of themselves as independent, autonomous, and endowed with rights. One should note, however, if the Pope and the leading hierarchy of the Church consider themselves more linked to Christ and to the apostles than they are to Senators Angeli and Bini, this same does not hold for General Crook, for example. Crook in particular feels himself closely linked to Aristotle and Plato, but he does not conceal, on the other hand, his links with Senators Angeli and Beni, and it is precisely here that we can discern the most significant character of Crook's philosophy. What are the maximum limits of acceptance of the term intellectual? Can one find a Unitarian criterion to characterize equally all the diverse and disparate activities of intellectuals and to distinguish these at the same time and in an essential way from the activities of other social movements? The most widespread error of methods seems to be this criterion of distinction and intrinsic nature of intellectual activities, rather than the ensemble of the system of relations in which these activities and therefore intellectual personified them have their place within the general complex of social relations. Indeed, the work of for example, is not specifically characterized by his manual or instrumental work, but by performing this work in specific conditions and in specific social relations, apart from the consideration that purely physical labor does not exist, and that even Taylor's phrase of training is a metaphor to indicate a limit in a certain direction. In any physical work, even the most degraded and mechanical, there exists a minimum qualification, a minimum of creative intellectuality. We have already observed that which must have to some degree a certain number of qualifications of an intellectual nature, although his part in society is determined not by these, but by the general social relations which specifically characterize the position of the all men are intellectuals, one could therefore say, but not all men have in society the function of intellectuals. When one distinguishes between intellectuals and non-intellectuals, one is referring in reality only to the social functions and professions of the intellectuals. That is, one has in mind the direction in which specific professional activity is weighted, whether towards intellectual or towards muscular nervous activity. This means that, although one can speak of intellectuals, one cannot speak of non-intellectuals. Non-intellectuals do not exist. But even the relationship between efforts of intellectual cerebral elaboration and muscular nervous effort is not always the same, so that there are varying degrees of specific intellectual activity. There is no human activity from which every form of intellectual participation can be excluded. Man, rather, cannot be separated from Homo sapiens. Each man, finally, outside his professional activity, carries on some form of intellectual